Welcome to AP U.S. History. This is Chapter 28. We'll be talking about the Civil Rights Movement in the United States. This movement starts before the 1950s and has certainly continued after the 1970s, but during the 50s and 70s, we see the strongest activity in terms of African Americans seeking their rightful place in American society. Um, there was something called Jim Crow laws that segregated African Americans from whites, particularly in the southern states. Plessy versus Ferguson had which was rendered by the Supreme Court in 1896, said that it was legal to have separate facilities for blacks and whites as long as they were equal. Unfortunately, they were never equal. The civil rights movement in terms of the mid 1990s or 1900, 1954. Prior to 1954, why is 54 significant? Because this is Brown versus Board of Education, which will desegregate public schools in America. Up to that point, it was acceptable to keep black and white children separated. In terms of prior to 1954, the pre-1900s, you had the abolitionist movement, you had the Civil War, Reconstruction, the 19th Amendment or 15th Amendment, which gave black men the right to vote, and of course you had Plessy versus Ferguson, which allowed for racial segregation. The 1930s, you have Booker T. Washington, two 1930s. Booker T. Washington, mostly in the 19th century. W.E.B. Du Bois, this comes out of this Harlem Renaissance, demanding the talented 10. NAACP, founded on the Niagara Movement in 1909, and it will be an organization pushing for advancement of African American rights. African Americans suffered the most during the Great Depression. Some places as high as 50% of blacks are unemployed. Roosevelt, unwilling to push too hard for African American rights, he did sign an executive agreement allowing blacks to work in the war industry and also in the government, but did little to promote African American rights. Philip Randolph, he is going to push for more civil rights for African Americans. He will pressure FDR, Roosevelt, into giving black men and women a right to work in the defense industry. Congress on Racial Equality is founded in 1940, and this is in conjunction with the NAACP to advance the rights of African Americans. President Truman did desegregate the armed forces. While he was president, he did try to improve the conditions of African Americans, but was pretty much unsuccessful. Jackie Robinson was the first African American to enter the Major League Baseball, which was there was a color barrier there. The NAACP will attack racism through the courts. The courts are going to do more than any branch of the government in terms of promoting African American rights. Thurgood Marshall is he will campaign against separate but equal. He will argue the case against Plessy versus Ferguson in terms of ending the separate but equal and also discrimination against blacks. He's going to argue the case Brown versus Board of Education before the Supreme Court and will win. He is also the first African American to sit on the Supreme Court. This shows Thurgood Marshall in the middle there, surrounded by other African American lawyers from the NAACP fighting for equality for African Americans. The famous case that will be decided in 1954 was really a combination of several cases, all relating to ending segregation in the United States. There was a black family living in Topeka, Kansas, which really wasn't part of the Deep South, but the family wanted their children to go to a local school. But the Board of Education said that they would have to transport their daughters across town to go to an all-black school. Supreme Court was certainly aware of how the significance of this case. In fact, Earl Warren pretty much single-handedly convinces the rest of the judges unanimously to end this practice. The case was heard over 2 years. Earl Warren, it's his court, and all 9, because he's a Chief Justice, argues that segregation has never been equal for black children, and it needs to stop. Little Rock, Arkansas, after the court's decision was made, one of the first states, Virginia, is going to pass a law that if they try to integrate schools, they'll withdraw funding. Something called massive resistance was practiced in the South to prevent racial integration. Little Rock, Arkansas, there were 9 students who wanted to go to the Central High School, but were denied entrance. They were called the Little Rock Nine. Eisenhower eventually has to send federal troops to ensure that these 9 children, black children, can go to school. Eventually, the next year, the school system is shut down in protest. These are the 9 African-American girls trying to go to school and being criticized by white Americans and their children. Federal troops, this is the first time that federal troops have been used since Reconstruction to achieve rights for African Americans. Montgomery, Alabama, we have Rosa Parks, who was an advocate. She worked in the civil rights movement, had been involved in it for years. Is ordered by a man to give up her seat in the front of the bus or the middle part of the bus, and she refuses. She's arrested and booked and charged $14. Eventually, that case is heard on the Supreme Court. Supreme Court will say that this is unconstitutional. The African Americans within Montgomery, Alabama, will boycott the bus. Martin Luther King will become the spokesperson. He's a reverend in the church, and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference will be formed and this will take an active stance against racial discrimination and abuse. This shows Rosa Parks, certainly an American hero, standing up for her rights at any cost. Rosa Parks, I did a little bio of her. Certainly not a giant, but certainly had lots of courage to stand up against racism in Alabama. Buses also, as a result of her actions, the blacks are just not going to ride the buses, and eventually, because of a Supreme Court ruling and also the City Council just giving in, because 90% of the buses were ridden by African Americans. So most of what the civil rights movement amounts to is nonviolence, and they're going to use boycotts as one of the means of changing people's minds. Certainly Martin Luther King, a little bio about him. He is going to be move to the forefront of leading the civil rights movement. Eventually he will be assassinated in 1968, same year that he won the Nobel Peace Prize. He leads a march in 1963 on Washington demanding a law that would grant people the right to use public conveyances and stay at places that they choose, and also a better treatment at jobs and so forth. So he's demanding a law that will solve that problem. The quest for civil rights became a nationwide movement in the 60s. African Americans will certainly advance their cause, but only at a great price. The three kinds of tactics that they use, or four, if you want to call marches, protest marches, boycotts, sit-ins, freedom rides. Martin Luther King adopted the same tactics that Gandhi did in India in terms of changing public opinion and pushing for what you believe in. In North Carolina, Woolworth store, African American college students were staged a set-in to demand service. Although there would be people working as African Americans cooking and doing the dishes, only white folks could sit at the counter. This strategy of nonviolence sit-ins seemed to be effective, and it's going to be used in a variety of places throughout the South. The Freedom Rides, this happens in the 1960s. The Congress on Racial Equality are going to send groups of blacks and whites to the South to prove that that buses traveling from state to state are discriminating against African Americans. Eventually, the Interstate Commerce Act or Commission will declare that these buses stop this segregation. Unfortunately, people will be beaten, buses will be burned to the ground. But it does call attention to the fact that African Americans their rights are being violated. This shows African Americans being harassed by white patrons at these Woolworth places for all whites. These show the Freedom Rides in the 1961, and as you can see that if you look at this closely, people are going to be assaulted, they're going to be attacked, beaten, buses are going to be set on fire. Eventually, these freedom riders are going to convince the federal government that something needs to be done. This shows another map of where they rode the buses and some of the buses being destroyed. We're going to stop here and pick this up next time.